So I had initially intended on developing this full series called God and Chaos, where I would talk about the subject of chaos theory as it relates to some of the more sophisticated versions of theism. I wanted to address the sophisticated versions because, well, the others are tantamount to low-hanging fruit, but also because, in the interest of rigorous proofs of logic, we owe it to ourselves to both appreciate and criticize even the more palatable versions of theistic argumentation. But given that I'm never going to get around to doing all of the things on this channel that I wanted to do, I figured I should just finally force myself to sit down in this sort of stream of consciousness way and push out as many of my ideas as I can. So I'll start off with a brief synopsis of my God is not God argument, and then work my way into addressing some of the other issues I wanted to tackle. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with my channel, a great deal of my focus is on the fact that we have a profound inability to understand how we understand things. And not even in terms of the great thinking philosophers of the last few thousand years, or even the modern science of neurocognitive development, but even just in terms of our daily lives, that we have a profound disconnection between ourselves and who we think we are. Even to the extent that we will often credit our rationality and our prefrontal cortex for making decisions that were actually based on information gathered by our limbic system. A case in point with there was a book called How We Decide by Jonah Lehrer, and in it he describes a study in which there were two stacks of decks given to participants, and written on these cards were various monetary values indicating an increase or decrease in the imaginary sum that they had. And their goal was to make as much money as possible, and what they weren't told was that between the stacks, one was going to give out larger payouts, but also larger penalties, while the other deck, having smaller bonuses, would have fewer penalties and would thus give them more money over time. And so their goal was to draw from either card, or from either deck of their choosing, at will, and to make as much money as possible. And what they found is that the participants had, and they measured this, they had an emotional reaction within the first 10 card draws to the deck that was giving them the larger penalties. And so after a series of card draws afterwards, all participants would exclusively be drawing from the deck that wasn't giving them the larger penalties, and as a result would be making more money over time. But consistently, at the same time, they were unable to provide a rational, conscious explanation for the decision that they were already making. That is to say that it took them another, I think it was 30 or 50 card draws before they would verbally be able to express how they were making their decision. But consciously they were incapable of identifying this, and so what the study shows is that we often base decisions that are logical, that are mathematically sound, but without having any conscious or rational justification for making these decisions. And so we often credit our prefrontal cortex when we really should be thanking our emotional systems. So my God is not God argument focuses on how we assess intelligence, specifically with respect to the relationship between simplicity and complexity. And so, just to break down my basic bullet points here, I would argue the following. First, people often misunderstand what it is to be intelligent. Second, and to that end, there is a difference between how we consciously and unconsciously assess intelligence. Third, when we unconsciously assess intelligence, our conclusions are more predictable, more reliable, and I would argue more accurate. And finally, the method by which we subconsciously assess intelligence is a very simple and deterministic system, which really removes a lot of the subjectivity of the whole process. And I kind of liken it to a Polaroid camera. We know the process, we know how the system works, and the only thing that determines what you see as a result is simply a matter of where you shift your focus. So there's a couple of different things to be learned from all of this. First, from the theistic perspective, is understanding the assumptions that go into these kinds of arguments, and from the non-theistic perspective, we should understand the kinds of, the basis of our reactions to hearing these kinds of arguments. Because for as many arguments as there are debunking Paley's watch argument, for example, I seldom hear any that actually strike at the emotional chord of where people are coming from when they adamantly disagree with these assertions. Because again, As much as we like to claim that we are perfectly logical beings, the reality is that we're not. Our brains are processing a lot of different information from a lot of different sources, and we should understand the underpinnings of those responses and address them on the point of how we are thinking about things realistically, not just in terms of the philosophical ideal of being purely logical, because we're not. And the last thing to be learned is that there is a necessary paradox to theism, or at least to any theism which asserts any cosmic design of any sort, because anyone who wishes to assert that there is a demonstration of God's ingenuity within the cosmos or in its material form, they must necessarily undermine their premise with their own conclusion. And so I go about explaining all of that. So to firstly address the assertion that there is a difference between how we consciously and unconsciously assess intelligence, let me provide an example by way of the pseudo-haptic illusion. Now, the haptic sense is essentially a group of tactile senses that deal with how we analyze our environment by interacting with it in a physical way. For example, when I grab this glass sculpture of a jellyfish, my tactile sense, or my haptic sense, is telling me that this is an oblong shape, that it's hard, that it's cold, that it exerts a force on my hand when I squeeze on it, etc., etc. Of course, it tells me nothing about its translucency or its color or any of those things, but in a physical sense, I can guess if I were to close my eyes what the object would be or what it might look like. And the interesting thing is that you would think that your hand would be the best source of information about what's going on in your hand. Now, it turns out not to be entirely true. There was a number of studies that have really played with this idea. One in which they were addressing how we feel torque. For example, when you pick up a coffee cup, you know just by looking at it that you have to torque the handle in a certain direction so that you don't spill the contents of the cup because it's weighted to the side that's holding the liquid. Now, what they did in this one study is they had participants stick their arm through a hole in the wall, and they would grab onto an object that would simulate being torqued to the clockwise or counterclockwise direction, and it would be the participant's job to assess through touching it which direction it was actually being turned. Now, at different times during the study, they would also provide them with a visual feed by way of a video camera that would tell them which direction the object was being turned. But they were also told consciously that this video feed might be flipped. And regardless of having this information being given to them, whenever the visual feed was flipped, the participants would, by and large, adopt the information being fed to them visually, and they would misinterpret what was actually going on in their hand. Which is to say that in terms of the information that our brains have to take in, they were taking in information from two different modes, and the brain had to do some error correction, and it opted to adopt the information from the visual feed and override and ignore the information coming from the hand. And of course, this means some interesting things for virtual reality as well, because that opens the gateway for this thing called the pseudo-haptic illusion, in which a visual feedback is able to provide a pseudo-haptic sense to the participant, which in English terms means that a participant can push on an object in virtual space, and by not seeing the response that they expect to see, the brain will think that the object has weight and mass, even though it actually doesn't. So what does this mean in terms of my whole argument here? Well, my point is that in terms of information processing, it makes sense that the brain would adopt any information that's readily available to it. And so in terms of conscious versus unconscious, it makes perfect sense that when we're not actively thinking about something, that we are free to make assessments, make judgments, and jump to conclusions, whether they're right or wrong, with the full freedom of everything available to the unconscious, from emotions to instincts and everything else. And conversely, it makes perfect sense that when we consciously assess something, that we can actually override the information that's being provided from other sources in the brain. That we can just as easily misinterpret or correctly interpret any information in our environment. To give it a case of misinformation, I'll just resort to talking about my brother real quick, because he is the most permissive parent that I know. but if you ask him, he will tell you, and he will deny this ad nauseum, but he thinks that he's a disciplinarian, and he absolutely isn't. So he's consciously told himself that he is a certain way, when in reality he's a completely different way. But consciously, people make assessments of themselves and their own image versus how they instinctively respond in reality. In fact, another YouTuber that I just recently subscribed to was talking about feminism and how feminists often claim that they want a nice guy when the reality is that they'll never touch him. And related, and the part that I thought was more interesting was the fact that she was acknowledging her own internal conflict in terms of spiders, that consciously she likes spiders and appreciates their role in the animal kingdom, and at the same time would instinctively smash them despite herself as soon as she sees them in her house. So again, there's all these conflicts between our conscious assessment of ourselves and each other versus how we actually are with ourselves and each other. So I think that in terms of assessing intelligence, I think there's something very similar going on. Now, the thing that I don't think I did communicate very well with my God is Not God series is that I didn't explain this mechanism, and I didn't clearly explain that I was attempting to differentiate the unconscious versus the conscious. And as a result, I don't think it was very clear what I was trying to do with the whole series, which I take full credit for, or full responsibility for, rather. And so, if you get around to seeing that series, I want to point out that my intention was to provide a series of situations that you could instinctively respond to and react to, and then in the post-production of your brain, be able to identify the patterns that you see across them, so that, in effect, I would be helping you build a conscious template of your unconscious self, so that you could identify the patterns across them and to see my point as far as the unconscious self and how we assess things. So again, I apologize for anyone who lost track and didn't see where I was going with all that, because I didn't communicate it very clearly. But that was my intention. Now, in terms of unconscious assessments of intelligence, the construct that I use is what I call the obstacle-goal relationship, which explains, contrary to popular belief, that all intelligence is based on simplicity, not complexity. Which is to say that space shuttles are not complicated because we want them to be, they're complicated because nothing simpler can get the job done. The mistake that people make when they consciously try to explain these phenomena is that they look at the complexity of a space shuttle and then they compare it to the complexity of, say, an automobile, saying that the space shuttle took more intelligence to create, and we know this because it's more complicated than a car, when the reality is that they're trying to do different things, and with respect to their respective goals, they are each as simple as they can be, and this includes the aesthetics of the car, the corners, and everything else. So people have made simple cars and they look like shit and no one buys them, so they have to be complicated visually and everything else that goes along with that. So the ingenuity that is demonstrated by a space shuttle cannot be compared on the basis of the complexity of the design without respect to the complexity of the obstacles that cause it to be complex. So, again, people often misunderstand the nature of complexity and how it relates to intelligence. And so my focus throughout the series is to explain that the opposite is true. And so by demonstrating this difference between the unconscious and conscious self, I can explain that it is impossible for anything to be so complicated that it had to be designed, which is precisely the format of any version of cosmic design. It's always along the lines of saying that it's too complicated, therefore it had a designer, when the reality is that isn't what intelligence is, and it never has been. And these aren't just my assessments or just my opinions of what intelligence is. I can demonstrate it throughout my series at every level of discourse, of every level of society, and so on. These aren't just my opinions of what intelligence is, it's everyone's opinion of what intelligence is. And so that's what I'm hoping to communicate to everyone. And you can even break this down to the most simplest level. My personal favorite is to use the mouse in a maze scenario, because with the cheese and with the obstacles in the box, we can explain how it is that we assess the intelligence of the mouse over time, especially as it runs the maze in successive courses. We expect the mouse to run into dead ends as it encounters them for the first time, and we would expect those instances of incorrect navigation to go away after the mouse has learned not to run into those dead ends. And if you were to take away those obstacles, for example, you would have to be able to explain 3 different scenarios. One in which the mouse does nothing, one in which the mouse goes straight for the cheese, and one in which the mouse runs into all the walls and hits everything but the cheese. Now, in the first scenario, if it does nothing, that could be for a number of different reasons, but the foremost would be perhaps that the mouse doesn't actually want the cheese, which is a possibility. So you have to, in terms of validating the construct of the maze, you have to actually know what the mouse is actually interested in, and you have to believe that the cheese is actually what it wants. If it doesn't actually want the cheese, then the whole test is invalid. But assuming that it does, and assuming that it wouldn't make any sense for it to sit there, you would have to have some way of explaining its inactivity. Now, in the case that it pursues the cheese and it goes in a straight line, you can only demonstrate that it's as smart as it takes to get to the cheese. That neither means that it's a genius nor that it's an idiot, but you know that it has a minimum level of intelligence to get there. But without the obstacles in the maze, you can't really discern how much information that mouse is able to process because it doesn't have to do much to get to the cheese. But in the last scenario, in which the mouse does everything but get to the cheese, it either doesn't want the cheese or it's an idiot. Or maybe it has a physical disability, which is essentially the same thing as putting walls in a maze. But in the scenario in which the mouse pursues a path that is extremely complicated with respect to a very simple set of obstacles, in which this case is none, you would have to conclude that the mouse is retarded. And this is what we do in our daily lives. When your boss does something and tells you to do something that is more complicated than what is necessary to achieve the goal, your instinctive reaction is, by necessity, to treat him like he's an idiot. Or, at the very most, you can give him some credit, or her, of course, some credit in terms of believing that they're intelligent, either based on past performance or based on the assumption that there's a number of obstacles that they're acting within, say political, that maybe you're not aware of, and that's entirely possible. But assuming that you know all of the obstacles, you can assess their intelligence based on the instructions that they give you and how complicated they are with respect to how complicated they need to be. And this is what we do on a constant basis. The paradox that this all leads to is the fact that you cannot substantiate the existence of a higher power or one that is intelligent without assuming that it's operating under obstacles, because a mouse that is infinitely powerful doesn't need to navigate the maze in order to get to the end. So if it wanted to get to the end and it wanted to get to the cheese directly, it could just blast through all the walls if it were infinitely powerful. And this is essentially the form of argument that everyone provides when they talk to a theist. Atheists are always asking, well, why doesn't God just snap his fingers and then everything happens? And inevitably, by necessity, the theist then has to contradict themselves by saying, oh, well, he was operating under these limits, he had to work with original sin, there's all this stuff about the snake and the apple and all this other stuff. All these things that detract from their premise that this being was all-powerful. So I explained in my series that there is this necessary paradox in which, in trying to justify and substantiate the existence of this higher power, they, by necessity, have to begin limiting him to prove or to validate the intelligence that he demonstrated, because if you can't demonstrate intelligence, you can't demonstrate the existence of a being, and without the being, you can't demonstrate you basically lose the whole point. So they have to, by necessity, prove his intelligence, and by doing so, they limit him, which prevents him from being the thing that he's supposed to be, which is infinitely powerful. You cannot demonstrate infinite quantities of intelligence and power simultaneously, because they are at complete odds with each other. You can only demonstrate intelligence within the confines of limitations, and so by demonstrating intelligence, you are unable to demonstrate omnipotence. And this is why there's all these difficult conversations regarding the word, and the default the default modus operandi of any religious person is to redefine omnipotence until it has no meaning. And I've shown this within my videos too, that if you go to Christian apologetics websites, they will redefine the word omnipotence until it has absolutely no meaning whatsoever. They will say things like, well, omnipotence is the ability to do anything that's within your nature, and then the example that they give is in talking about how fast you can run as a human and saying that that's within your limits. So basically they just said that humans are omnipotent also, as well as my cat, because my cat can run a certain speed, and that's within its limits as a cat because it can run cat speed, which makes it omnipotent apparently, according to Christians. So that's essentially the conundrum that they're constantly in. They have to undermine their own argument by providing a conclusion that is contrary to what their premise is. So that essentially is my God is not God argument, and what I want to focus on now is the more sophisticated versions of theism and how they relate to the conundrum of subjectivity within the obstacle-goal relationship, which is to say, again, that what we see is dependent on where we shift our focus. For example, if you look at a smartphone, obviously you could say in one respect it's extremely simple. You swipe your finger, you can gain access to websites, to music, you can do all sorts of different things with these things, and all it takes is just a swipe or a press of your finger. So in one respect, they're very simple. And on the software level, though, they're also getting more complicated. And they're getting increasingly complicated at the same time that the user interfaces are getting more simple. So they're on opposite trajectories. So in what context can we say that they're intelligent, or that we are handling them in an intelligent way over time? Well, they're both valid, actually, because the complexity of the software is only increasing with respect to what it takes to make the user interfaces more adaptable and more intuitive, and to provide more goals, more things that these things are capable of doing. Same thing happened with Windows. The user interfaces, the mice, the whole advent of the computer age is based on making them more user-friendly to non-computer people, because there's no point in a person buying something that they can't use. And so it makes sense to make things more simple over time. But in what respect do we say that things are getting more simple over time? If you look at science, you can see that the more we've understood about reality, and more that we've understood about the physical universe around us, we've seen the phenomena get more and more complicated. The textbooks get bigger and bigger, and there's more and more to learn about the universe. And then, curiously, at some point, it starts turning around again. In some respects, the universe has become more simple over time as people have understood more about it. If you look at evolution by natural selection, it was the first of many arguments and proposals that it explains how complexity can come from simplicity, and how all these different organisms can come about. And by understanding this simple mechanism, we can then interpret and understand all of the complexity that we see around us. So if you focus on the outcome is complicated, but the process is simple. In the same way, mathematical subjects like chaos theory can explain how a very simple mathematical system can be both simple and entirely deterministic, and yet also yield unending complexity and be unpredictable simultaneously. It's a very fascinating subject. By the way, I meant to mention this before, but if you haven't seen the BBC series on The Secret Life of Chaos, I highly recommend it. But the point of me mentioning chaos theory with respect to God is that there are all these different scientific phenomena now that we can use to link all these things together and to explain how a non-thinking system can be intelligently employed to produce complexity for the purpose of some end to be assumed or to be discussed. So I don't think it's surprising at all that we would find these more sophisticated, more scientifically minded ideas floating around. Of course, they have to break away from the traditional canon of religious thought, but people who nevertheless believe in a higher power will employ some more scientific ideas in their thought processes, and will give credit to the higher power for the processes as opposed to the outcomes. while the creationists who don't understand the processes will default to focusing on the outcomes and believe that the higher power is directly responsible for the individual production of each of the things that we see in our universe. And I think that by understanding this, we as a third party, as the non-believers, can better appreciate both sides and understand our responses to the both of them, especially in terms of appreciating where we agree and where we disagree. And I believe that on a philosophical level, that we actually sympathize with creationists because we believe that if a God did exist, creationism should be true. That is to say that if that in terms of the obstacle relationship and all intelligence being based on simplicity, if a higher power wanted something and it were capable of achieving it, it would have it already because it's a higher power. So creationism makes sense. Creationism should be true. The only problem that we have in terms of adopting their position is that they're wrong. That we have all the scientific findings, we have all the evidence, we have all the DNA that shows over time how all these things happened over time, and we know for a fact that they are incorrect. So philosophically we agree with them, but on the scientific, on the factual side, we have to disagree with them. On the other side, we have the evolutionary biologists who believe in higher powers, who we agree on the scientific level, but whom we must disagree with on the philosophical level on account of those processes. In order for God to employ these scientific concepts in a meaningful way, the science has to pre-exist those processes. And in so doing, they are demonstrating that this higher power is more limited, that he is subservient to more rules, and therefore less of a God than the God of the creationist. And so I think that explains why we have a sort of visceral response when we kind of hear these ideas, even if we can't necessarily put our finger on it or put a verbal explanation to how we feel in response to the arguments that we have to contend with. So I hope that made sense, and I hope you found that interesting. I guess that's about it, and thanks for watching.